Well, welcome everyone. We're going to be kicking this off in a little bit. We opened it up a little bit early here, about 3 minutes to go before noon. So we just wanted to say thank you for joining us. We have Sam Towler with us. This is our Unregulated Historical Meandering Series, number 5, the Liberation and Freedom Days edition. It'll be a slightly different format than we normally have, more kind of a speaker series with Sam presenting his research and knowledge of the African American history of Monticello, and wanted to put a few plugs out there. This is a part of the larger program for Liberation and Freedom Days that is happening all this week. I'll be putting some information in the chat for Zoom and in the comments in Facebook with some links for the things that I mentioned in a little bit here. But I don't know if you can all see, I got my Liberation and Freedom Day shirt on. Haven't yet done the walk run. Well, definitely will walk it. Don't really feel like running it. Maybe Sterling will run it, but I won't. He feels the necessity to run every once in a while. I really only run when chased. But then in our COVID day and age, they also have a mask that you can wear to be completely safe and take care of everything that you need to take care of while you're outside with your Liberation and Freedom mask on. I think they have run out of smalls and mediums on their shirts, and well, I have a large, so that's one good thing to have a large shirt. I guess I could get mine, but they will have those available, I think, by the end of the week, and we'll be letting people know. And for all of the events for Liberation and Freedom Day, you can check out the Jefferson School website, which is jeffschoolheritagecenter.org. They have all the updated events there, and I will be putting that information in the chat also so that it can be shared far and wide. So we're almost here to noon. Just want to give it a minute here, see a few more people coming into the waiting room, and my phone is telling me that it's noon. I don't want to do that. Okay, let's see. Oh, too much technology. There we go. Okay, so we're at noon here. I want to thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, this is our Unregulated Historical Meandering Series. This is the 5th one in our series, Liberation and Freedom Days edition with Sam Towler. As we let some more people log in, I'd like to welcome everyone to leave any comments in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments, or email us at programs@albemarlehistory.org. Send us any questions you would like to address during the show, or you can send us any suggestions you have for future shows. A few announcements before we get started. Charlottesville's Liberation and Freedom Day celebration, commemorating the March 1865 anniversary of the emancipation of the slaves in Charlottesville and Albemarle County when Union troops occupied the region, is well underway as we speak. Some great programs have already taken place this week, and I think you can check it out on the Jefferson School webpage to get to any recordings or video for the online programs. But there's still more to come, and you can check out the full list of events on the Jefferson School website, and I will link that into the comments after I've done with my introduction here. If you haven't yet, you can participate in the Reparations Fund Run Walk and help raise money to help the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center teaching program. the NAACP's Youth Council, Vinegar Hill Magazine's Black Business Advertising Fund, We Code 2, African American Teaching Fellows, and 101.3 Jams. And if you do participate, then you get this great little t-shirt. And also in our COVID day and age, a mask. So hopefully you can join that up. Donations are for a good cause. Friday from 1 to 4 p.m., Follow the Path to Freedom memory event will take place at the UVA Monument to Enslaved Laborers. This is actually an in-person event. They're going to restrict it to a few people entering into the monument and be able to do that safely. So if you want to participate, that's at UVA. Also Friday at 1 p.m., Thomas Jefferson's Monticello will have a Liberation and Freedom Day live Q&A, and our own Sam Towler, who you are going to hear today, will be participating in that with Calvin Jefferson, who's a descendant of Monticello's enslaved community, and Monticello's Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer, Gail Jessup White, and I said also with local historian Sam Taylor. So they're going to be following up. There'll be kind of a extended Q&A. So you'll hear Sam today, and if you have any additional questions or think about him overnight, you can then ask him on Friday. Saturday at noon, the Virginia State University Drumline will perform at the Jefferson School City Center, and they will be streaming that on Jefferson School Facebook page. And I also think they'll have them live out there on the parking deck outside of Jefferson School. But I think it's a drive-up event. So if you drive up in your car, you can listen to the Virginia State Drumline. And for Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, next week on Tuesday, we have our Ask a Genealogist. Next week's session will be Finding Her, Our Female Ancestry. This will be with Shelley Murphy and Miranda Burnett, our research librarian. And we'll have special guest Melissa C. Tennant to focus on how do we find female ancestry in our genealogy. You can register on the James Jefferson Madison Regional Library website for that event. On Tuesday, March 16th at 6 p.m. for our speaker series, we will have Betty Kearse, who will be talking about her book, The Other Madisons. I will be putting some information, as I mentioned, along with everything else here in the chats and comments, so feel free to look there for these events. So enough with the announcements. Let's make some history.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sterling Howell here with Tom Chapman of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and we'd like to welcome you to Unregulated Historical Meanderings, the Liberation and Freedom Days edition. This is our 5th unregulated, unstructured live show in which we invite some person or persons to join us and have a casual conversation about things of interest to our friends here in Charlottesville, Albemarle area and beyond. However, as it is unregulated, we can do whatever we want. So this time we're going to do something a little different. Our special guest today is Sam Towler. Sam grew up in Charlottesville, Albemarle, hearing stories about how one branch of his mother's family, the Baileys, lived at Monticello during the Civil War years. But as he became interested in learning more about them, he discovered that in all that has been written about Monticello, nothing had been mentioned about the Baileys. And at the same time, he realized that not much had been written about the African Americans who lived there either. So over the years, Sam has researched not only his family, but the African Americans who were at Monticello before and after Liberation Day. For us today, Sam has prepared a presentation called The African American Experience at Levees, Monticello, pre-post 1865. So Sam, thank you very much for joining us, and the show is yours.
Okay, so you can, some background, Uriah Levy bought Monticello in 1834, and he lived until when the Civil War started, and he declared for the Union, and he died in 1862 during the Civil War. Right before he died, he hired Joe Wheeler, who had been a farm manager for Benjamin Randolph, who was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. And then Uriah Levy hired him in 1860. Wheeler stayed at the house about 20 years, and Wheeler didn't have any children. He had one son he adopted, James Bailey, and that's who I'm related to. Okay, so, but today we're going to talk about the African Americans that were with them, and what happened to them during the Civil War and what happened to them after the Civil War. So, Ira Chapman Garrison was the manager before Joel Wheeler was hired in 1860. So you can scroll down some. The first thing that happened during the Civil War was Albemarle required all free Black men to work in public service. And mainly in Charlottesville, it was working at the hospitals. So we had one free man at Monticello, and he was requisitioned, and he went off. They sent him to Pulaski. I don't know what was in Pulaski, but beside his name, it says he was sent to Pulaski. Watson Buck was the other free man who was at Highland Farm, Monroe's farm, just down the road, and we'll get into how he's connected later. So in that 61 list, there was only one guy at Monticello that was affected, and that was Lewis Harvey, the free man. He had married one of the enslaved persons at Monticello. Okay, you can scroll down. The next event during the Civil War was the Confederate government required enslaved people to go and work on the fortifications of Richmond. So twice during the Civil War, people from Monticello were sent to work on the fortifications of Richmond. And on one in 1863, we have a list of we know their names and their ages. So this helped figure out some of the people. And Dr. Benjamin Randolph, where Joel Wheeler had been, sent a person named Beverly to the fortifications of Richmond. And Beverly's wife was married to a former slave of Joel Wheeler. So, okay, we're ready for the next slide. At the start of the Civil War, Uriah Levy was pro-Union. He was from New York, and the Confederate government started working to seize Monticello and take it away from him and sell it. And his local attorney, George Carr, delayed the sale. But finally, in November 1864, the Confederate government put up for sale Monticello and other lands that Uriah Levy owned, including all his slaves. So on that day, Monticello sold for about $80,000. The Washington farm was a lot more land. Of course, it didn't have a famous house like Monticello, but if you know where Highland Ash Lawn is, it's about 1,000 acres on the other side of the road. It had been formerly James Monroe's, part of his tract, and Uriah Levy bought it in 1837, just a few years after he bought Monticello. So all of Uriah Levy's slaves, which were 19 people, sold for $64,500, so not quite as much as what Monticello itself sold. And then the contents of the house and all the livestock sold for the most, 123, totaling 350. And I'm getting all this from a New York Times article that you can find all online. One interesting thing about this is that there was an elderly couple that was not sold. And then later on, when I was looking at the Highland Farm, the Massey family owned it. They had a farm book, and one of the Levees was giving some money to the masses to give to Richard Smith. So I think Richard Smith and his wife were the couple that was not sold that day. Oh, I might also mention, so Benjamin Ficklin bought Monticello on that day, but he also bought 8 of Uriah Levy's slaves. So they stayed, 8 of them stayed at the house of the 19 he owned. The Levy family also bought one person, John, and he may have stayed. So about 9 of Levy's slaves when the Confederate sold them. And the person who bought most of Uriah Levy's farm was the Confederate government itself. They sent a J.H. Parker agent for the Confederate government, and the only thing I can think of is maybe they were going to strip all the trees off the land and use it for building fortifications, but I would assume the war ended before they could get to that. All right, we're ready for the next one. So the next event is in March the 4th, 1865, about 75 to 100 Union troops came to Monticello, and a local African-American was their guide telling them where to go, and he was James Thomason. And after the Civil War, the Levy family hired James Thomason, and it's probably Ashiel Levy, who owned the Washington farm, is who hired him. So that on March the 4th, they took 2 horses, grain, a whole bunch of hogs, and that kind of stuff. And we get the account because Wheeler made a claim after the Civil War. If you were in the South and you were pro-Union and they took supplies from you during the war, you could make a claim after the Civil War. And Joe Wheeler did that. And he got about 1/3 of his money that he claimed. They didn't allow the horses, but they allowed, and so these are some of the papers. Fold 3 has the whole document if you want to look at it. Several of Joel Wheeler's slaves supported his claim. And then one person, Nelson Robinson, I don't know, most of the African Americans who supported his claim said they were former slaves, but Nelson Robinson said he didn't. So I'm not sure how he fits in. All right, we're ready for the next one. These are examples of 2 of the short depositions. One of them is Mary Johnson, says she was so-and-so years old and reside at Monticello. And the other one is Malvina Watson. And she lived at his house in town. And she said somebody called the Yankees came on that day. But anyway, both of them say that they saw the grain taken. I'm not sure if they saw the horses taken. So there were some people like T.W. Savage was appointed mayor of Charlottesville by the Union Army. So the pro-Union people local, and there weren't very many of them, did support his claim. So it must have been true that he was pro-Union. I mean, he worked for Uriah Levy. So you can find all that on fold 3. All right, we're ready for the next slide. So Aggie was the main slave of Uriah Levy, and she died in 1858, and Uriah Levy does mention him in some letters. And then Cinder Stanton sent me an email one day that somebody was researching the Minor family at Carsbrook, and in the will book, there's a mention that Uriah Levy bought Aggie in 1835, 1 year after he bought Monticello. So far, I think Aggie is the only one we've seen in the will book where exactly who Uriah Levy bought a slave from. In 1860, the census shows he owned 21 people, but I think Aggie's family was the main one that he owned. And so she married John West. And the reason why I found out so much about him is, well, one, what's important is Martha West, her daughter, married Willis Shelton. Willis Shelton lived on the adjacent plantation, Judge Reeves. And apparently, after the Civil War, not too many years, like in the late 1860s, Willis Shelton became gatekeeper at Monticello. So he married Martha West. So and Willis was the gatekeeper at Monticello up to 1902. So we're talking a very long time. And so probably the longest person who ever lived at Monticello is the descendants of Aggie, who Uriah Levy bought in 1835. Now, where I found a lot of this information was, this, you can go to the next slide. So my relative, James Bailey, in the 1880 census has Joshua West with him. And Joshua West turned out to be a son of Aggie. So Joshua West buys a house in Charlottesville a little bit after 1880. Apparently in 1880, he was still working for James Bailey. And he had a wife, but he died in 1920 in Charlottesville, and his house was almost directly across from the Daughters of Zion cemetery that's being restored. And he left no will. And so there was a West versus West chancery case in Charlottesville. And for maybe 6 months, I didn't look at it. So I just figured it's probably John West, the wealthy John West in town, something about his estate, but it wasn't. It was about who are the relatives of Joshua West, who died in 1920 owning this house. So one of the first things they say in the case is, we went up to Monticello and talked to Thomas Rhodes, who was the manager of Monticello after Wheeler. And Thomas Rhodes was interviewed, and he said the Hendersons, who were still living at Monticello, were descendants of his because Martha had married Willis Shelton. Daisy Buck was a sister of Martha, and she was still living in 1920. So the Watson Buck, the free man at Highland Farm, a son of his, William Buck, married Daisy West. And what was also important in the case, it said there was a first cousin who was Dr. Eugene Dickinson of Harrisonburg, who was a son of an uncle. And so this gave me the Dickerson name. That's the first time I discovered that her name must have been Dickerson, who married John West. And so then I just looked online by a fluke, and darn if I didn't find a photo and a write-up about Dr. Eugene Dickinson. So here was a nephew of Aggie, the slave, who died in 1858, and her nephew became a medical doctor by 1900. So I looked in the deed books, and we have in Charlottesville a house still standing that was Dr. Dickinson's father's house. It's at 415 5th Street Southwest. And, you can just look online at the assessors and get a picture of any house you want. So that's what this is. And this, in 2014, is when I looked up his house. So you can find a little bit about him on the internet. I don't know what happened to Dr. Dickinson after 1920. Okay, you can turn the page down. You can go ahead and turn it. So this is the nearest picture that I could find of a relative of Aggie. So Dr. Eugene Dickinson, who was in he was in Stanton in 1910, in Harrisonburg in 1920. he's the closest picture. So also, now this is talking about, so Willis Shelton was owned by Judge Reeves at a neighboring farm, and he married one of Aggie's daughters. And so he lived at the gatehouse till 1902. And then down below, if you go to the Monticello website, you can read about the Hendersons. So they married a daughter of him, and Willis Henderson, he may be Willis Henderson Jr., was still working at Monticello in 1950. And Willis Henderson Sr. worked for Jefferson Levy, who owned the house after 1879. So some descendants of Aggie were working at Monticello from 1835 to the 1950s. You can go ahead and turn the page. Oh, yeah. So there was Ned and Betty were the parents of the Hendersons. And in 1862, I saw where a Betty owned by Uriah Levy died, and a Ned, a 3-year-old, died. So I think the Betty that died in 1962 is the ancestor of the Hendersons, but I'm not positive. But I'm pretty, I think it is. But somebody could prove me wrong. And so here's a picture of Willis Henderson and the Levees. And this is from Mark Leapson's blog. You can find some of his blogs. He did a book on the Levy family that came out in 2001. Okay, you can turn the slide. Right, you're looking in the green, Uriah Levy's other purchases besides Monticello. They're right across from Ashlawn Highland. I'm used to calling it Ashlawn. I know they call it Highland now. But so in 1837, Uriah Levy bought that. And James Thomason, who led the Union Sheridan's troops as a guide on March the 4th, 1865. You can find that in Fontaine Wells' claim for compensation. The 1867 personal property tax of Albemarle, the tax collector wrote down on what farms African-American men were living, and James Thomason, who had led the Sheridan's troops, were living at the Levees, which I think is the Washington farm here, because in the Massey Farm Book at Highland, Ashlawn, you get the Thomases mentioned also. And one of the Thomasons bought land right to the east of the Washington farm. I've got it marked there. And Watson Buck, the freeman at Highland, also bought land. And so Daisy West, the daughter of Aggie, the slave of Uriah Levy, she married William Buck, and they inherited Watson's Buck land to the east of the Washington farm. And okay, we can go to the next one. So the Baileys, who were at Monticello, had a slave named Rachel. And then this is a little bit of what I know about her. She married Joshua Smith, and Shelley tells me that Joshua Smith was rented to the UVA in 1864, and he was owned by one of the Watsons who lived near Monticello. And so this is what I know about them. One of them, Thomas Sellers, the little infant, I think is a picture of their descendants. On the previous slide, their big purchase, I think it was around 1920, was Sneed's Mill, which was about 300 acres adjacent. If you look to the right of the Washington farm, you'll see Sneed's Mill on my map, Well, Thompson did this map for me. And so they bought 300 acres, Sneed's Mill, in about 1920. And the lumber business was the big back then. And they had a couple of years and then resold it. But I think the 300 acres was the biggest purchase I saw of a former slave. And also, one of them bought directly adjacent to Jane Bailey Duke, who was a daughter of who was a Bailey. My mother's ancestors, E.L. Bailey, owned Sunnyfields back in the 40s around the corner. All right, we're ready to come down lower. So because Joel Wheeler had been a farm manager for Ben Randolph, it turns out that there are quite a few letters in Ben Randolph's, the Randolph Hubbard papers at the UVA. And so I looked through them for many days, and then it turns out, so I knew Beverly was owned by Ben Randolph rather than Wheeler. His wife Malvina was owned by Wheeler at Monticello, but Beverly was owned by Dr. Randolph. So again, Lewis Mason buys a house in town, and he dies with no will, just like Joshua West. And there was a big chancery case over his house. So I figured, so that case tells me that there was a Farrell Gaines that first married Ann Massey, gives me her surname, and then Jeanette. And then I looked on the Monticello database, and Farrell Gaines, there was a Farrell who's mentioned in Martha Jefferson's will, Thomas Jefferson's daughter. And Senator Stanton told me Farrell Gaines, or we didn't know it was Gaines at the time. Farrell is also mentioned as belonging to Lucy Marks, Thomas Jefferson's sister. And there was a Charles and Sally that Thomas Jefferson owned, and they had daughters, Jeanette and Carrie Ann. So I figured, I think the chances are about 98% that Farrell Gaines first married Carrie Ann and then married Jeanette, her sister. And all of this comes from a chancery. Once you get down below, so this mainly is coming from the Monticello database and also from the chancery case over Lewis Mason's house. Going back to the fortifications, a Lewis owned by Uriah Levy was sent by Wheeler to work on the fortifications of Richmond. And Lewis Mason was the only Lewis that I could find that had a connection to Monticello from some papers. And his age does match the Lewis owned by Uriah Levy. So I think Lewis Mason is the Lewis owned by Uriah Levy. All right, we're ready for the next one. So in going through the Randolph Hubbard papers, I noticed that there was a reference of Davy and Beverly going to Gettysburg with Lewis Randolph, Dr. Randolph's son. And there's quite a bit about Beverly in the papers. So either Beverly or his brother went with Lewis Randolph, Dr. Benjamin's son, to Gettysburg. Miss Randolph's brother, who owned Redlands Farm, was saying, I don't think you should be sending those guys north of the Mason-Dixon land, because they had been going by themselves, riding, like if they had to bring a horse back or take Lewis a horse, they would get on a train by themselves and go by themselves. So apparently they trusted them to do all this. But the Robert at Redlands was saying, I don't know if you should send them into Pennsylvania, like they might run off or something. Okay, we're ready for the next slide. So I was at the courthouse maybe 10 years ago, or maybe could have been 15. And here comes Gail Schulman with somebody. And I said, what are y'all looking up today? Oh, we're looking up Ann Carter's ancestor, Beverly Watson. I said, well, how many Beverly Watsons can there be at one time? And it turned out to be the same person. So here I ran into a descendant of Beverly Watson, Ann Carter. I think she still lives in Charlottesville. I run into her every once in a while. And so they told me what they knew, and I told them what I knew. And she didn't know back as far as I did, and I didn't know the recent stuff. So Beverly Watson and his cousins, the Staples, they owned quite a few houses in town. And so I went to the assessor's office, and down below on my summary sheet are 3 of their houses that they owned at one time. So Ann Carter, I think, is the only descendant that I ran into by accident, just at the courthouse. All right, we're ready for the next one. So there was an Ann owned by Uriah Levy. I don't know her surname, but she may have been at West, another daughter of Aggie. I'm not sure. I keep saying I'm going to look for a death certificate, but so she and her 7 children are the ones that at the 1864 sale of Monticello were bought by the new owner, Benjamin Ficklin. So they were able to stay at the house. But right after the Civil War, they decided to leave. So not everybody stayed at the house. You know, some stayed till the 1950s, others left right away. And I noticed that her sons-in-law mainly worked at the woolen mills, Peyton Nightingale and Jesse Smith. And that's about all that I've been able to, haven't been able to track them any further than that. But they stayed in Albemarle for a while working at the woolen mills. She married Jack Carey, who I found out was also owned by Judge Alexander Reeves, as Willis Shelton was. That's a long story how I found that out, so we'll pass on that for now. Okay, we're ready to go on the next slide. Okay, so going back to Mary Johnson, who supported Joel Wheeler's claim, her mother was Elizabeth, who had 10 children. And so at the time of the Civil War, Uriah Levy owned almost 20 people, and Joel Wheeler also owned close to 20 people. Most of them were Johnsons or the Watsons that I've already talked about. And so I traced the Johnsons down to Maud, who married Winston Goings, and Winston Goings was a World War I vet. One of the Johnsons married a Trueheart. The Truehearts had land off Ridge Street. One of them married Winston Goings, who was a World War I vet, and their house is just a few houses east on Grady Avenue from the Monticello Dairy building that's being restored. So maybe 5 or 6 houses up Grady is. Another thing I found out is that one of them started the Albemarle Messenger Service with Mr. Shelton, who was Rebecca Guinness's ancestor. At one time, the J.F. Bell Funeral Home was in the office of the Albemarle Messenger Service. And Mary's son Ruffin lived until 1970. So like here's a former slave, her son lived until 1970, and he's buried at Oakwood. So I found a picture of Winston Goings and Maud on the internet and a picture of their houses and made a little chart. Okay, we're ready for the next one. At the time of the raid in 1865 on Monticello, there was a William Barber at the house who gave a short deposition. Then later on in the Chancery case, there was a Reuben Barber who married Mary Johnson. So Reuben Barber has to be a relative of William, maybe a brother or something. And Reuben was Mary's second. Mary was Reuben's second wife. The 1867 personal property tax shows him at Carr's Hill. And then one day, maybe 6 months ago, they say, there's a picture of a house on Carr's Hill in 1867, and they say a Reuben is in it. Do you have any idea who it could be? Well, the only Reuben, the personal property tax saying there's that Reuben Barber lives at Carr's Hill, and he's there in 1867, so it has to be him. So this is a blow up, I think, of Mary Johnson's husband, Reuben Barber. And maybe she was with William Barber during the Civil War, and then maybe he died and he married her brother. That's what I'm thinking. Okay, we're ready for the next slide. If you go to the Monticello website, you can find a lot. You can find the Colemans on quite a bit about them. So during the Civil War, Joel Wheeler was charged by letting his slave Tom go at large and trade as if he was a free man. So I think for sure that has to be Tom Coleman. He was married to a Jane, and I'm not sure if Jane was not owned by Uriah Levy, and I don't think she was owned by Wheeler either, or else that would mean Wheeler would own all these Colemans, and with the Watson and Johnsons, it would mean he would own about 30 people. And so I think Jane was owned by somebody else. So Tom Coleman, even after Wheeler left the house in 1880, he stayed at the house, and a death record in Albemarle shows that he died at Monticello in 1888. James Bailey, Wheeler's son, in a case, says that some of the slaves, not workers, went to Bailey's out in Greenwood, which is my ancestor. And in the census, there's two of them there, Henry Coleman and Jefferson Monroe. So if I had to guess who Jane was, I'm saying that Jefferson Monroe is related to Henry Coleman. And I'm thinking that Jane might be Jane Monroe is her surname. That's my best guess. So I did meet online Michelle Miller, who's a descendant of Tom Coleman. And she's also a descendant of the Lewis Harvey, the free man that I said lived at, the free man that lived at Monticello was married to Amanda Coleman, who was a daughter of Tom Coleman and Jane. Lewis Harvey moved to Iowa, as to many African Americans after the Civil War, to work in mining. And Michelle was able to find a tombstone for Louis Harvey. So she sent it to me. And she helped me with research over the years, and I helped her with her. So Michelle Miller and Ann Carter are really the two descendants I've interacted with. So so Tom Coleman and his family stayed at Monticello for a very long time. Well, not everybody, but some of them. So after Willis Shelton died in 1902, Elizabeth, the wife of Tom Coleman Jr., became the gatekeeper at Monticello for many years. And one of their descendants was married a Harris, and Paul Harris, Esquire attorney, was elected as Albemarle's in the House of Representatives in Richmond. I think it was either the 1970s or 1980s. And he's an attorney in Northern Virginia. Grew up in Charlottesville and became an attorney and also the representative. So he's a descendant of Tom Coleman and Jane, and Tom Coleman Jr. All right, we're ready for another slide. Just as a side, I'm looking for any pictures I can find. The 1870 census, just so you know, has a Swiss artist, Franz Bücher, with the Baileys. And it turns out he was a pretty famous Swiss artist. He went around Charlottesville in 1870 painting mainly African Americans. And so one of his masterpieces that's in a Swiss museum is the Song of Mary Blaine, done in 1870, which is shows him. If you look in the background of the Mary Blaine, it looks like either Monticello Mountain or Patterson Mountain, Carter's Mountain. So I think this would have to be on the Belmont farm. And then this house to the right, I think is the same house. His masterpiece on the left was probably that outbuilding back there. I did look and see if the Belmont house has chimneys, and it has chimneys on both ends. So it's possible this is a painting of the Belmont house with the porches maybe were changed later on in time. So I can't say that any of the African Americans at Monticello are in his paintings, but I just wanted to mention it. All right, ready for the next slide. So for a long time, I was trying to figure out who Jim was that was owned by Uriah Levy and sent to the Fortifications of Richmond. And I thought, well, it has to be Jim Thomason, but it turned out that's not true. So there was a Thomason that fought in the Revolutionary War, and his widow came to Albemarle, and the people that owned Morven and owned Ashlawn Highland let her rent there. And she had one slave, Frances, who her son, John, had quite a few children with. And this is all explained in at least 2 Albemarle Chancery cases. And so James Thomason led, they called him quasi-free. So Sarah freed her slaves, but only after their father died. So John C. Carter, who went to Missouri, he rented the slaves out and the money went to Sarah. And then later on, Fontaine Wells rented them out. And so they were getting money for their grandmother, basically. And there's a connection to Ewan Carden at Monticello, which I stick in there. And so James Thomason, one of the Thomasons, is the guide for Sheridan's troops in 1865. And then likely Ashiel Levy, who owned the Washington farm, hires him. And so the 3 Thomasons are listed as living at Levees, which is probably the Washington farm, working for Ashiel Levy. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. He's the nephew of Uriah, and Uriah left him the Washington farm. And then later on, the Thomason family intermarried with the Lewis Harvey family, the free man I was talking about, and also the Sampson family. And the Sampson family worked at Monticello like in the 1910s, 1920s. All right, we're ready for the next slide. So I'm still trying to figure out who Jim was that went to work on the fortifications. So here we are. Here's an example of the 1867 personal property tax. On the left, you'll have the names of the African-American men. Just men had to pay the tax, so no women are on it. And on the right is what farm they're living at. So Nelson, Jim, and I think it's William or Robert, are living at Levees, which more likely is the Washington farm rather than Monticello, because they're mentioned in the Massey books at Ashlawn Highland. And then here is a marriage, and they say they work at Monticello, and I think it's 1929. And although it says Richard and although it says Thompson instead of Thomason, other papers say Thomason. And also they went by the name, by the 1870 census, they went by the name Thomas instead of Thomason. So they were at Monticello. Some of them were at Monticello for a long time. All right, ready for the next slide. So briefly, this was the first case that I'd heard of them calling somebody quasi-free.
I had to look it up.
So there's a couple of chancy cases where they all explain that the Thomasons are grandchildren of their owner. John Thomason is their father. And John C. Carter, who went to Missouri, says that they considered themselves free and they were hard to manage. And he also calls them quasi-free, like they were rented out, but if they went to somewhere that they didn't like, they would go back to the Thompson household and not Thomason, and they wouldn't make them go back. But they knew they were getting money for their grandmother, so some of them voluntarily worked. All right, we're ready for the next one. There was a Nelson Robinson that backed up Joel Wheeler's claim for compensation for the 1865 raid. He's listed as being at Benjamin Sowell's farm in 1867, so he didn't stay at Monticello very long, and I couldn't figure out his connection to Wheeler. The Sowell house was restored and moved to Mickey Tavern, so you can see that house. It's right below Mickey Tavern is the Sowell house. But in the census of 1970, there's a Ned Robinson almost exactly adjacent to Joel Wheeler. So he must have been at Monticello. So Ned and Nelson probably have a connection, but I can't find a document that shows it. And the descendants of Ned Robinson and Elizabeth, you can see in the census, they're with Thomas Perkins and also with Thomas Mickey. You can find Thomas Perkins in the Thomas Rhodes, who was the manager of Monticello after Wheeler. You can find Minnie Robinson and Thomas Perkins with Thomas Rhodes, and then you can also find at least up to 1910. And then there's a little bit of information in the J.F. Bell funeral records online. All right, we're ready for the next slide. So this is like a quick glance summary. So in orange, a neighbor, Judge Alexander Reeves, who owned Carlton Farm, owned Willis Shelton and Jack Carey, who married former slaves of Uriah Levy. So Uriah Levy's slaves are in blue. And then the people that were descended from Thomas Jefferson slaves through Wheeler being a farm manager are in gray. And so if I'm correct that Lewis, owned by Uriah Levy, is Lewis Mason, and the age is correct by, we know that from Lewis being sent to the fortifications and they put down his age, and then you look in the census. And so Lewis Mason and Melinda Gaines is like, that may be the only marriage that I know of so far of a descendant of Thomas Jefferson slaves and Uriah's. And you also have Malvina Green marrying his half-brother, Beverly Watson. In black is Joel Wheeler's or Bailey and slaves. And then in green are the free people, Lewis Harvey and the Thomasons. The Thomasons became free in 1864 when their father John died. So right before the Civil War. And then in clear, the Robinsons, I don't know enough about them, but there were some Robinsons at Benjamin Randolph's. So I'm sort of leaning that there must be a connection to Benjamin Randolph at Round Top Farm. All right. These are just some summary of what documents I looked at. I mean, I didn't sit around a campfire and my parents or grandparents told me all this. I had to go out and research it. And thanks to Bob Vernon, he showed us about the personal property tax, showing where people are living, and Michelle Miller, who I met online, the descendant of Lewis Harvey, and Ann Carter, who I bumped into at the courthouse, a descendant of Beverly Watson, and then Cinder and Steve and Anna Burks and Gail Schumann and Robert Bailey. He died in 1962, so my grandmother, and he was a son of James Bailey, Wheeler's adopted son, and my grandmother was his next of kin, and he left us a bunch of papers, so that's what I started looking. I looked through his papers the first thing. All right.
Thank you very much, Sam. We did have a question. Is Thomas Sellers related to Thomas J. Sellers, who was the publisher of the predecessor of the Charlottesville Albemarle Tribune?
That's what I'm thinking, yes.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kay. Tom, did you have any questions from Facebook?
No. Just a few accolades, fantastic genealogy information from Alinda Brown Gore, and Lorenzo Dickinson calls you a treasure, Sam, a treasure to historical research, and I can't agree more. I see in the in Zoom chat they add a little bit more about Delegate Paul Clinton Harris, who was a member of the Virginia Assembly, 1998 to 2002. First African-American Republican elected to the House of Delegates since Reconstruction, and in 1997, and then he won re-election in 99. And he's also a participant in Monticello's Getting Word Oral History Project. So there's some lots of people saying this is great. Let's see, Phyllis, what do you know about treatment of slaves by Levy and Wheeler?
I do know that Uriah Levy thought a lot about Aggie, and when she died in 1858, there was a couple of letters where he hates that she died. I think he was in the Mediterranean at the time, writing to the farm manager. And then at the 1864 sale, where the Confederate government forced all his slaves to be sold, Jonas Levy, the brother, came and bought John, who I'm pretty sure is Aggie's husband, John West. So a lot of them stayed at the house after the Civil War, so I wouldn't think that they would have stayed on if they were treated badly. As far as Joel Wheeler's, I don't know that much, except the one record of him being charged with letting his slave Tom go at large and trade as a free man, who I think is Tom Coleman. Those are the two things. Of course, nobody wants to be a slave, but so I don't know of any whippings or anything like that. No.
Shelley's asking, do you think Aggie Dickerson is related to Warren Dickinson?
Well, I do know. You mean Lorenzo Dickinson?
She says Warren.
Oh, that's Lorenzo Dickinson's ancestor, Warren. It's a possibility, but okay. I don't. that's a lot of Warren Dickerson's were out at Keswick, but we're talking about the same county. The Dickinsons here were at Carsbrook, which, is north of Charlottesville. The house is still standing at Carsbrook, and there's a subdivision there with that name. That's where those Dickinsons were. So that's not a real far apart to say they might be related.
There's a question on Facebook. Where are good places to see these genealogies as a map or infographic? I know we have some of the stuff that's online there, and there's Steve Thompson and Bob Vernon have done with the property taxes. But it requires some work to dig out the information.
Right. I know.
Basically, you're the one who's created all those charts that you presented.
Well, Steve Thompson did me that map of the Washington farm a couple years ago when I first asked him about it. He mapped it out for me. But Bob Vernon has done a lot of mapping of Albemarle. But a lot of times, I did an index of all the surveys recorded in the will books from about 1850 to 1900 that I have in Word that I've given out to people. I was going to do it as a book, but I never did. So I just give it out to whoever wants it. The first surveys of Albemarle were recorded in their own survey book. And then around 1850, they started recording them with the deed itself that they go to. So that's an index of that.
Well, I thank you, Sam. I think there's one more question, I guess, in terms of mentioning the gatehouse keeper. Somebody who says they're not sure exactly what it is. What can you tell us about it, and how did it function?
So if you go up to Monticello and you go under the underpass and come around, you'll see the gatehouse right there. I think it was to anybody coming to visit Monticello. It was a private home. You would have to stop there, and you could ask permission from the gatehouse person to go on the grounds, or if the Levees were at home, or that. And so basically, it was like, there's always people coming to see Monticello, even when it was in private hands and stuff. And so they were like the gatekeepers, like they would tell you where you can go and where you can't go, or they are letting people in the house today, or they aren't letting people in the house today, that type of thing. But the gatehouse is still there. You can see it right beside the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you again, Sam. This has been pretty incredible in terms of as somebody described, the labor of love that you've put into your research and your work here. And I'm glad we had the opportunity to bring you into the Zoom world and get this information out to people, and help tell a little bit more of the story of the African-American experience at Monticello at the time in March of 1865, when the Union troops came through. And I think it's a pretty cool story about having one of the guides there who led the Union troops around trying to figure out what was what. If anyone else has any more questions, or if you want to follow up with anything, I know I saw somebody ask how they can get a handle on your copy of your Word document. So you've got some people interested in that, Sam. So I've asked them to email us. And with that said, I want to thank you, Sam, and I'm going to leave it off to Sterling here to close us out.
All right, thank you. Before we go, we invite any suggestions again. Please tell us, help us figure out where we're going to meander from here. Any future topics, any suggested guests, let us know. Don't forget to check out the rest of the Liberation and Freedom Days activities going on through the weekend. We posted a link to the website in the chat earlier. Thanks, Tom. And remember, everything that we do as your historical society is because of your support. If you have not joined us as a member, please consider doing so. Our annual individual membership is $45. That's a very small amount that goes a long way towards supporting this program and all of our other programs. And you will have free access to all of our programs, our research facilities, and our annual scholarly magazine, which alone is worth the membership price. The current issue includes a terrific article by William Kurtz, Managing Director and Digital Historian at UVA's Knoll Center for Civil War History, titled Black Virginians in Blue, the Untold Stories of Albemarle County's U.S. Colored Troops. So please support your historical society. Visit our website to join or call us at 434-296-1492. Unregulated Historical Meanderings is brought to you by the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society and our wonderful supporters like you. So thanks again, Sam, for Zooming with us today and sharing all your great information. And thanks to everyone out there for joining us and supporting what we do. I'm Sterling Howell here with Tom Chapman, and we hope to see you for the next Unregulated Historical Meanderings. Until then, meander on.